8 years in a row, Mara Ashcroft entered the marriage audition, and 8 years in a row she walked away empty-handed, not because she was incompetent, but because the name her father left behind weighed more than any debt. But tonight, as she prepared to leave for the last time with her last remaining dignity, the barn door burst open, and a bloody man, fresh from a deadly snowstorm, walked straight toward her. He doesn't choose the most admired women in the room. He chose someone who was rejected by the whole town, like, comment with the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because this is just the beginning. The cold came early to Frostville Crossing that year. It wasn't the kind of cold that surprised anyone. The mountains had been exhaling frost since the first week of October, dragging ice down from the high ridgelines and pressing it flat against the valley floor until the mud hardened to iron and the well ropes stiffened overnight. By the second week of November, when the alderman's barn went up with its oil lanterns and pine bough decorations and the smell of mulled cider drifting all the way to the edge of town, the cold had already settled in like a permanent resident, like it owned the place. Mara Ashcroft had lived in Frostville Crossing her entire 26 years, and she had never once gotten used to November. She stood in front of the small mirror that hung crookedly on the wall of her bedroom. The nail had pulled loose from the plaster 2 winters ago, and no one had fixed it since. And she looked at herself the way a person looks at something they're trying to convince themselves is adequate. Her dark hair was pinned back tight. Her dress was the green wool one, the better of her two, and she'd let out the hem last spring so it sat properly now instead of hovering awkwardly at mid-calf. The fabric was good quality, or had been once. Her mother had made it. Her mother had made a lot of things that were good quality once. "You don't have to go," said her sister from the doorway. Mara didn't turn around. "Yes, I do." "No, actually, you don't. There's no law written anywhere that says Mara Ashcroft has to walk into that barn and let Hester Caldwell look at her like she's a stray dog that wandered in from the cold." "Della, I'm serious. You've done this 7 times. 7 times, Mara. What's the point of an 8th? Mara finally turned from the mirror. Her sister Della was 19, still young enough to think that pride was a luxury a person could afford on a regular basis. She was also right, and they both knew it, and that was the worst part. "The point," Mara said, pulling on her coat, "is that if I stop going, it means I've given up, and I'm not ready to give up yet." Della leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed. "What exactly are you not giving up on?" Mara didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she had an answer. She buttoned her coat to the throat, picked up her gloves from the washstand, and walked past her sister and down the narrow stairs of the house their father had mortgaged 3 times and finally lost. They still lived in it. That was the arrangement. Harlan Beckett, who now held the deed, let them stay on through the winter in exchange for Mara's work keeping his accounts and Della helping his wife with the laundry and mending. It was a practical arrangement. It was the kind of arrangement that felt like charity and was meant to. Beckett was generous in the specific way that men are generous when generosity costs them nothing and buys them something. In this case, the satisfaction of being seen as decent while also having his books kept meticulously and his shirts pressed without wrinkle. Mara had been keeping the books since she was 17. She was good at it. Numbers didn't lie to you the way people did, and they didn't leave you the way her father had, packing his bags one gray morning and walking out toward the eastern road and never coming back, leaving behind a wife who died of something the doctor called fever, and Mara had always privately called heartbreak, and 2 daughters in a mortgaged house with a name that meant nothing anymore except debt. The alderman's barn was half a mile down the main road. Mara walked it alone, the way she always did, her boots crunching through the thin crust of snow that had fallen the night before. The lantern light from inside the barn was already visible from a distance, warm and orange against the blue-black of the winter night, and she could hear the fiddles starting up. She stopped just outside the doors for a moment. 8 years. She had been 15 the first time, dragged there by her mother, who had still believed in the matchmaking gatherings with a kind of desperate optimism that Mara had never quite inherited. Back then, the Ashcroft name had only just begun to sour. Her father had been gone 2 years, but people had still been willing to extend a kind of courtesy, a patience, a wait and see. By the time she was 18, the patience had run out. By 20, the courtesy was gone entirely. By 23, she was coming because the alternative, not coming, staying home, accepting the verdict, felt worse than the humiliation of showing up. She was not sure that calculation still held. She pushed open the door and went inside. The barn was full. It always was. The matchmaking gathering was the social event of Frostville Crossing's winter season, which was saying something in a town that didn't have much of a social season to begin with. There were perhaps 60 people packed into the space, the men on one side in their cleaned-up clothes and combed hair, the women on the other in their best dresses. The alderman family had strung pine boughs along the rafters and set out trestle tables with cider and small cakes, and the fiddle player, old Reuben Marsh, who was half-deaf and played slightly too loud, was working through a reel in the corner. Mara came in, stamped the snow from her boots, and felt the shift in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't people stopping and staring. It was subtler than that, and worse. The slight cooling of the atmosphere, the way conversations didn't exactly pause but recalibrated, turned a few degrees away from her. A glance exchanged between the Hartley sisters. A small, tight smile from Hester Caldwell, who was standing near the cider table in a dress that had clearly cost more than Mara made in a month. Hester was 31 and already twice matched, and twice widowed, which should have made her an outcast, and instead had made her, somehow, the social center of gravity in every room she entered. She had money. Her second husband had left her a considerable amount. And in Frostville Crossing, money went a long way toward rewriting the rules of what was acceptable. "Mara," she said pleasantly, "I didn't expect to see you again this year." "I come every year, Hester." "Yes." A pause, just long enough to be pointed. "You do." Mara got herself a cup of cider and moved away before she could say something she would regret. She found a spot near the wall, slightly back from the main gathering, and settled in to wait. This was the part she had never figured out how to do gracefully. The waiting. The gathering had a loose structure. First the mingling, then the formal introductions, then the dancing, which was when the actual business happened. Men would ask women to dance, and from those dances agreements were sometimes made. Courting was sometimes begun. Matches were sometimes struck. It was all very civil and civilized, and underneath it ran a current of very specific economic calculation, because that was what it was, really. A transaction dressed up in pine boughs and fiddle music. Mara had not been asked to dance in 6 years. She had been asked the first 2 years, once by a young farmer named Corbin Oakes, who had danced with her politely and then never spoken to her again, and once by a traveling merchant who hadn't known about the Ashcroft name and had asked purely on the basis of finding her pretty. That second dance had ended when Hester Caldwell appeared at the man's elbow and explained the situation to him in quiet, efficient terms, and he had thanked Mara and excused himself, and she had stood on the dance floor alone for a moment that lasted approximately forever. After that, she had stopped expecting to be asked. She watched the room. The Hartley sisters were both already engaged in conversation with men, the older one with Jonas Whitfield, who ran the sawmill, and the younger with a newcomer whose name Mara didn't know. Clara Benning was dancing with the blacksmith's son. Even Patrice Oakes, who had a scar across her jaw from a childhood accident and a disposition that most people described as challenging, had found a partner. The cider was too sweet. Mara drank it anyway. "The Ashcroft girl is here again." She heard it from behind her, 2 male voices, not bothering to lower their volume particularly. "Every year like clockwork. Feels almost cruel at this point, doesn't it? Felt cruel 4 years ago. Now it just feels like stubbornness." "Her father's debts never cleared?" Cleared. That's a word for it. Beckett holds the deed on the house. Rumor is the girl's keeping his books just to stay under a roof. So anyone who takes her takes on the whole situation. That's the size of it." Mara stared at the middle distance and kept her face entirely neutral. She was good at that. 8 years had made her very, very good at that. The formal introductions began. Elias Alderman, who organized the gathering each year as a kind of community service that also happened to benefit him socially, called the room to order and went through the traditional format. Available men would speak their names and occupations. Available women would do the same. It was brief and practical, and only slightly less dignified than a livestock auction. When Mara's turn came, she said her name and said she kept accounts, and there was a small silence in the room that was different from the silences that followed other names. The silence that followed other names, was just a pause. The silence that followed hers had a texture. Then they moved on, and she exhaled. An hour passed. The dancing had been going for 40 minutes. Mara had long finished her cider and was debating whether to get another cup. Not because she wanted cider, but because having something in her hands was better than having nothing. When Elias Alderman appeared at her elbow. He was a decent man, Elias, not unkind exactly, but he had the specific discomfort of a person who wanted to be kind and also wanted to avoid anything that might be socially costly, and those two desires were perpetually at war in him. "Mara," he said quietly, I wanted to speak with you before. I don't want you to be caught off guard, is all." She looked at him. "Say it plain, Elias." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I've spoken with a number of the men here tonight, and I want you to know that the hesitation isn't about you, personally. It's the situation. The debt, the name. People have their own families to think about, their own. No man is going to ask me to dance tonight. I'm sorry. Is that what you came over to tell me?" "I came to tell you before the end of the evening, rather than after, so you could—" He stopped. "I don't know, so you could decide how you wanted to handle it." Mara set her empty cup on the table next to her. She looked around the room, buzzing the dancing couples, the lantern light, the pine boughs, Hester Caldwell laughing at something with her hand on Jonas Whitfield's arm, even though Jonas Whitfield had a wife at home who was 8 months along and not in any condition to attend gatherings. "Thank you, Elias," she said. "You're right. I'll head home." She got her coat from the hook near the door. She was pulling it on. She was doing the buttons, when she heard the noise from outside. It started as a sound she couldn't immediately place. A wind, maybe. A branch coming down under snow weight. Then it got louder and she recognized it as a horse, moving fast and hard, and then before anyone could react to what they were hearing, the barn doors blew open. Not opened, not swung wide. They came inward with a force that knocked one of the pine bough decorations from the nearest rafter and sent the cider cups rattling on their table and made Reuben Marsh break off mid-reel so abruptly that the fiddle let out a screech. The man who filled the doorway was— Mara would think about this later, trying to find the right word for what he looked like standing there. Large was technically accurate but missed the point. He was the kind of large that seems to take up more space than the physical dimensions should account for, broad through the shoulders in a way that the sheepskin coat he wore emphasized rather than concealed. Snow was crusted in his dark beard and in his hair and on the shoulders of the coat. There was blood on the left side of his jacket, not a small amount, dried brown at the edges and still darker at the center, and his face had been cut somewhere above the right eyebrow, a gash that had bled down and dried in a dark line along his cheekbone. He stood in the doorway with the winter night behind him and looked at the room. The room looked back. "Thorne," said Elias Alderman, in a voice that suggested he was reassessing several things simultaneously. "K.L. Thorne, we weren't expecting— I need a horse," the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, which seemed wrong given what he looked like. "Mine came up lame a mile back. I left her with your hand at the stable." Of course, we can— and water." He was looking around the room now, not at Elias, not at anyone in particular, just taking it in. "I'll pay what's fair. You're welcome to the cider, and there's a pump out." Elias stopped, because K.L. Thorne had stopped looking around the room in general, and had started looking at something specific. Mara realized, several seconds after everyone else in the room apparently already had, that what he was looking at was her. She had her coat half-buttoned and her gloves in her hand, and she was standing nearest to the door because she had been on her way out, and the practical result was that she was closer to him than anyone else, and also slightly separated from the main group. But that wasn't why he was looking at her. She could tell that much. He wasn't looking at her because she was the nearest person. He was looking at her the way you look at something you were trying to find and just located. "Who's she?" he said to Elias. The room did something complicated. About 30 people managed to simultaneously go very still and yet somehow convey significant amounts of social information through minor adjustments in posture. Elias cleared his throat. "That's Mara Ashcroft. He hesitated. She keeps accounts. Ashcroft, Thorne repeated. Something moved across his face that Mara couldn't read. He walked toward her. He walked toward her, not toward the cider or the pump or Elias Alderman or any of the reasonably attractive and socially acceptable women between him and the door, and the room parted for him the way rooms do when they don't want to get in the way of whatever is about to happen. Mara did not step back. She considered it. The man was very large and very blood-stained and had just destroyed the atmosphere of a carefully curated social gathering by existing in it. But stepping back felt like a worse option than holding her ground. So she held it. He stopped when he was close enough that she could see the cut above his eye clearly, and the exhaustion in his face underneath the dirt and cold, and the way his breath was coming slightly harder than normal, which told her that whatever he'd been through to get to this barn had been genuinely brutal. "You're leaving," he said. "I was." "Heading home?" That was the plan. He looked at her for a moment, not the way men usually looked at her at these gatherings, which was either through her or past her. He looked at her like he was measuring something, and like the measurement was coming out the way he expected. "I'm Cale Thorne," he said. "I trapped the upper ridges from here to the Coldwater Divide. I've got a cabin about 2 days' ride into the mountains. I came down for supplies and to settle some accounts, and I heard there was a matching gathering in town." He stopped. "I'm not good at talking around things, so I'll just say it. I need a partner. Someone who can keep accounts and manage the trade side of the business while I work the lines. I've got enough put back that the arrangement would be fair, and I mean fair. Half share of everything we build from here." Mara stared at him. "I'm not asking you to be my wife," he said, apparently reading something in her expression. "Or not only that, I'm asking you to be a business partner. The other part is, that's a separate thing we could work out." From somewhere behind her, Mara heard Hester Caldwell make a small, disbelieving sound. "You don't know anything about me," Mara said. "I know you keep accounts. I know you've been coming to this gathering for years and walking out alone, which tells me either you're very particular or this town has decided something about you that I'd want to hear from you directly." He paused. "I know your name came up when I asked in town who was good with numbers. It came up first, every time. Whose name came up second?" Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, exactly. "Feller named Beckett. But I already talked to Beckett, and I didn't like him." Behind her, the room was absolutely silent. Reuben Marsh had lowered his fiddle to his side and was watching with his mouth slightly open. Mara thought about what she was looking at. A man she had never seen before, half covered in blood and trail grime, offering her something so far outside the boundaries of what she had come to this barn expecting that she wasn't sure she was hearing it correctly. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Elias 20 minutes ago. She thought about 6 years of standing near the wall while the fiddle played and watching other women dance. She thought about half share, she said. "That's what you said?" "Half of everything built from the point you come in. That'd need to be written down and signed by someone who can make it stick." "I can write it myself and it'll stick." He nodded, like this was not a surprising answer. "There are things I need to know," she said, "before I agree to anything." "Ask them." "The blood on your coat. What happened?" "Came through the Harrow Pass. There was a man on the upper trail who thought my pack was worth more than the trouble of asking for it. He was wrong." "Is he dead?" "No. Considerably inconvenienced, but no." "The cabin. Is it sound? Roof, walls, insulation?" "Sound enough. Could use work." "The trapping operation. How many lines? How are they distributed across the territory?" His expression had changed. He was listening to her differently now, more carefully. 7 lines currently. North and east faces of the upper ridge, 2 on the western slope. The distribution's not ideal. There's territory I haven't worked because I've been managing alone. "And the accounts? What's your current arrangement for selling the pelts?" "Go through a broker in Millhaven. I think he's taking more than his cut, but I haven't had time to work out the numbers." "He probably is," Mara said. "That's a common arrangement, and it's almost never in the trapper's favor." She looked at him steadily. "I can fix that." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." Mara became aware, in the way you become aware of something that has been true for a while but just registered, that the entire gathering was watching this conversation. 60 people, absolutely still. Hester Caldwell's expression had done something complicated. It had moved through disbelief and arrived somewhere that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. I have a sister, Mara said. She's not part of the business arrangement, but she'd need somewhere to go. I'm not leaving her here. Is she useful? She's 19 and she works hard and she learns fast. He thought about this for approximately 3 seconds. Fine. I'll need a few hours in the morning. I have an arrangement with Beckett that I need to dissolve properly. I won't leave him without giving notice. You're worried about being fair to Beckett? I'm worried about doing things right. There's a difference. She held his gaze. And I want it in writing. Everything. The partnership, the half share, the specific terms. We can write it tonight if you want. I do want. Then we'll write it tonight. He extended his hand. It was a large hand, scarred across the knuckles, still cold from the trail. Deal? Mara looked at the hand. She looked at the room full of people who had been watching her walk out of this gathering alone for 8 consecutive years. She looked at the pine boughs and the lantern light, and Hester Caldwell, and Elias Alderman's stunned expression, and the empty cup she had set on the table by the wall. She shook his hand. The grip was firm and brief and businesslike, which was exactly what she wanted. Deal, she said. Checked. They used Elias Alderman's kitchen table to write the agreement, because Elias offered it before he'd had time to think about whether he wanted to, and by the time he'd thought about it, they were already seated, and Mara had borrowed pen and paper from the drawer near the hearth. Kyle Thorne sat across from her with his coat off and his wound cleaned. She had told him, in the flat voice she used for stating obvious things, that he was going to clean that cut before they wrote anything, because she was not going to sign a business agreement with a man who was bleeding onto the table. He had looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his version of finding something amusing, and he had cleaned it himself without complaint. The agreement took 40 minutes to write, because Mara wrote carefully and completely. She had seen enough of what happened when agreements were left vague. Her father's situation had involved several such agreements, all of which had turned out to mean something different than what her father had believed when he signed them. She was not going to make that mistake. She specified, equal ownership of all trapping proceeds from the date of the agreement forward, equal stake in any future expansion of territory or operation, her right to renegotiate the brokerage arrangement in Millhaven, a separate household accounting that would be maintained transparently. Terms for dissolution of the partnership if either party chose to exit with fair division of accumulated assets. Thorne read everything she had written. He read it carefully, which she noticed and appreciated. You left out the personal arrangement, he said when he reached the end. That's because the personal arrangement isn't business. She met his eyes. It's separate. How separate? Entirely separate. If you want to discuss it, we can, but not in a contract. He considered this. Fair enough. He picked up the pen, which looked slightly too small in his hand, and signed his name at the bottom. His signature was plain and clear, not ornate, just legible. She signed below it. Elias Alderman witnessed it because she asked him to, and because he was the kind of man who would, in the end, do the decent thing when it was clearly the decent thing to do. When it was done, she folded the paper and put half in the pocket of her coat. The other half she gave to Thorne. Now what? He said. Now I go home and pack what I can carry, and I tell my sister, and in the morning I go to Beckett and give him proper notice. She stood up and pulled her coat on. I'll be ready to leave by noon. She had her hand on the kitchen door when he said, You're not what I expected. She stopped. What did you expect? Someone more... He stopped, seeming to look for a word. I don't know. More broken. Mara turned back to look at him. He was sitting at the table with the fire behind him and the cleaned cut above his eye and the weariness all through his face, and she thought about what she wanted to say and whether to say it. I've been told my situation was bad for 8 years, she said. That doesn't make it true. It just means people believed it long enough that it started to feel like fact. She looked at him. I'm not broken. I'm tired, which is different. He held her gaze for a long moment. I'll be at the stable by noon. She nodded and went out. The walk home was cold. It was always cold this time of year, but she felt it differently tonight. not as something trying to get in, but as something she was moving through, covering ground, one boot in front of the other in the snow-crusted ruts of the main road. The gathering was still going on behind her. She could hear the fiddle starting up again. Reuben Marsh returning to his reel, slightly off-tempo, the way he always played when something had disrupted his concentration. She imagined the room reassembling itself, the conversations starting back up, the slow settling of everything that had just happened into the sediment of Frostvale Crossing's social history. She imagined Hester Caldwell's face and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but was close enough to it to count. Della was awake when she got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a candle and a book, which meant she had been waiting up. She looked at Mara's face when she came in and set the book down slowly. What happened? Mara hung up her coat. She told her sister everything, plainly and in order, the same way she'd written the agreement. No embellishment, no drama, just the facts arranged logically. Della listened without interrupting, which she was capable of when she understood that interrupting would be a mistake. When Mara finished, there was a silence. You said yes, Della said. I said yes. To a man you met 45 minutes ago. Approximately. Who was covered in blood. The wound was superficial. Head wounds bleed significantly more than their severity warrants. Mara sat down across from her. I need you to come with me. That's not negotiable. I'm not leaving you here. I wasn't going to argue. Della was quiet for a moment. Are you scared? Mara thought about it honestly. Yes. But you're going anyway. Yes. Della looked at her for a long moment. Her older sister, whom she had watched walk into that barn 8 times and walk out alone, and who was sitting across from her now with a signed piece of paper in her coat pocket and a look in her eyes that was different from the look she usually came home with. What does he look like? She asked. The trapper. Large, dirty, cut above the eye. Mara paused. He reads contracts carefully. Della absorbed this. Is that the most romantic thing you've come up with? It's what I noticed. Her sister laughed, a short, slightly helpless sound. All right, she said. I'll pack. They packed that night, what they could carry, what mattered. Mara's mother's quilt, the household ledger book she'd kept since her father left. 3 changes of clothes each. Her good boots and Della's only decent pair. The tin with the emergency money she'd saved. Not much, but more than nothing, the accumulated result of small economies practiced over 8 years. She packed the woodworking tools her father had left behind because he hadn't been the kind of man to take practical things with him when he ran, and she had been using them for minor repairs on the house since she was 18. She could not think of a reason to leave them. She left the house itself. Beckett's house, she reminded herself, which helped, without particular ceremony. The cracked plaster walls and the lopsided mirror, and the kitchen where her mother had cooked, and the room where her father had slept before he'd decided that sleeping in his own house was less appealing than whatever was at the end of the eastern road. She went through each room once, not from sentiment, but from the habit of thoroughness. She didn't want to leave anything important behind. There was very little that was important. In the morning, early, while Della was still packing the last of her things, Mara walked through the gray pre-dawn to Beckett's main house and knocked on the door. His housekeeper answered, then fetched Beckett himself, who appeared in his dressing robe with the expression of a man who had not expected to be dealing with complications before breakfast. Miss Ashcroft. His eyes moved over her, took in her coat, the purpose in her posture. Something shifted in his face. A recalibration. I heard there was some excitement at the gathering last night. That's one word for it. She told him she was leaving. She told him clearly and directly that she had made a new arrangement and that she was giving him this notice rather than simply leaving because she had agreed to keep his accounts through the end of the month, and she intended to honor that in the only way still available to her, which was to leave the books in a state that someone else could pick up without confusion. She had been at the kitchen table until 2 a.m. doing exactly that. She handed him the ledger books, each one clearly labeled, each one up to date. He took them. He looked at them. His face did several things in quick succession that Mara chose not to analyze too deeply. You're serious, he said. Yes. This trapper... We've signed an agreement. It's witnessed. Beckett was quiet for a moment. He was not at heart a cruel man. He was an opportunistic one, which was different. He had exploited her situation because it was there to be exploited, and she had allowed it because the alternatives had been worse. She held no deep resentment toward him. She simply had nothing left to give him. "The house," he said. "You'll need to be out by— We'll be gone by noon." Another silence. "I hope it goes well for you," he said, finally, with the air of a man who was surprised to find that he meant it. "Thank you, Mr. Beckett," she said. "I've left the accounts in good order." She walked back through the cold morning, and the sun was beginning to come up behind the mountains, turning the snow on the high ridges a pale gold. And she thought about 2 days' ride into the mountains and a cabin that could use work and 7 trap lines with distribution that wasn't ideal. She thought about half. She had asked for half without knowing whether she could hold it. She still didn't know that. But she had learned, in 8 years of keeping other people's accounts and living in other people's houses and attending other people's social gatherings as a ghost in a green dress, that the things you asked for and received in writing were more real than the things you waited to be given. You waited long enough, you ended up waiting forever. She did not intend to wait any longer. At noon, she and Della walked to the stable with what they could carry, and Kyle Thorne was there, his wound properly bandaged, and his face slightly less exhausted, and a pack horse loaded beside his own mount. He looked at the two of them. He looked at what they were carrying. "Is that everything?" he said. "Yes," Mara said. He didn't say anything about that, didn't comment on the fact that everything they owned fit between the two of them with room to spare. He nodded once, like a man acknowledging a report, and helped them load what they had into the packs. The town watched them leave. Not ostentatiously. Nobody lined up on the street to see them off. But curtains moved in windows, and at least 3 doors were opened slightly more than the temperature warranted, and Mara felt the weight of being observed all the way to the edge of town. She did not look back. Della, riding beside her, said quietly, "You're not even going to look back?" "What for?" Della turned in her saddle and looked, doing it for both of them. Then she faced forward again. "Nothing," she said. "You're right. There's nothing to look back at." The road curved north and the town dropped behind them, and ahead the mountains rose white and enormous against a sky that had cleared overnight and was now the pure hard blue of deep winter, the kind of sky that offered no softness, only clarity. Cale Thorne rode at the front without talking. That suited Mara well enough. She was not in the mood to talk. She was in the mood to think, which she did, steadily and practically, about trap lines and brokerage arrangements and what it would take to make a mountain operation work. The cold was significant and the road was rough, and her horse was a borrowed animal she didn't yet know the temperament of. She was not going back. The road north was not a road in any sense that Frostville Crossing's main street was a road. It started that way, packed dirt, cart-rutted, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without incident, and then, about 4 miles out of town, it began making decisions. It narrowed, it tilted. It developed opinions about where it wanted to go that did not always align with where a person needed to be, and by the time the mountains had properly closed in on both sides, it had stopped pretending to be a road at all and become a trail, marked more by the absence of trees than by any deliberate construction. Mara rode without complaint. Her horse, a gray mare she'd borrowed from Beckett's stable and intended to pay for properly once she had income to pay with, a fact she had written in a note and left in the ledger, was sure-footed and sensible, which were the 2 qualities she most needed from an animal she didn't know yet. Della rode behind her on a smaller roan that Thorne had apparently acquired as a second pack horse and pressed into passenger service. Thorne rode ahead. Not far ahead, the trail didn't allow for much distance, but consistently in front, which Mara attributed less to any desire to lead and more to the practical fact that he knew where they were going and they didn't. He didn't talk much. She had noticed that in the barn and at Elias's kitchen table, and she noticed it again now. He was not a man who filled silence with words out of habit or discomfort. He talked when he had something to say. She found this, on balance, a quality she could work with. By midday they had gained significant elevation, and the town was invisible below them, buried somewhere in the valley under a thin layer of cloud. The temperature had dropped another 6 or 7 degrees. The trail wound through stands of pine and spruce that pressed close on both sides. their branches heavy with old snow, and occasionally a branch would release its load without warning and send a cascade of white down across the trail that startled the horses, and twice landed directly on Della. "This happens a lot," Della said, after the second time. "Until you're used to reading the branches, yes," Thorn said, without turning around. "How do you read a branch?" The ones about to drop looked different, slightly blue-gray at the edge, overloaded. Della squinted up at the trees. "They all look the same to me. They will for a while." This was, Mara noted, the longest exchange he'd initiated since they'd left town. She filed it away, not dismissively, but practically. He was teaching them something. He just wasn't announcing that he was doing it. They stopped at midday beside a frozen creek, where a section of ice had broken away and left a small dark pool of moving water. Thorn had dried meat and hard biscuits in his pack, which he distributed without ceremony, and they ate standing because the snow was too deep to sit comfortably. The horses drank from the open water. "How much further?" Mara asked. "Day and a half if the weather holds. Day and 3/4 if it doesn't." She looked at the sky. It was that same hard blue from the morning, but there was something at the western edge, a density that hadn't been there at sunrise. "It's not going to hold," she said. He glanced west, looked at the cloud bank she'd indicated. "Probably not." He seemed unsurprised, which suggested he had already accounted for this. "There's a stop I use on the trail, stone structure, solid roof. We'll make it before the weather comes in." "You were already planning on that?" "I was planning on either outcome," he said. "The shelter is faster. Pushing through is possible, but harder on the horses." He looked at her. "You read weather." "I read patterns," she said. "It's not much different from reading accounts. Things accumulate in a direction." He was quiet for a moment, and the way she was beginning to understand meant he was actually considering what she'd said rather than dismissing it. They pushed on. 8. The shelter was a low structure tucked against a granite outcropping about a mile off the main trail, connected by a path that Mara would never have found on her own, but that Thorn navigated without hesitation in the fading afternoon light. It was stone-built, old. She could not have said how old, but the mortar between the rocks had darkened to nearly the same color as the stone itself, and the threshold was worn smooth. Inside was a single room with a stone hearth and 3 pine bunks built against the walls, and a stack of dry wood that someone had left, and someone had the obligation to replenish before leaving. "Trapper's custom," Thorn said when she asked about the wood. "You use what's there, and you replace it." "Who maintains the system?" "Everyone who uses it, or everyone who understands they might need it to be maintained for them someday." Mara thought about the economic logic of that, a shared resource maintained by collective self-interest rather than any formal arrangement. It was actually quite elegant, if everyone held up their end. She imagined most did. The people who used these trails in deep winter were not, she suspected, people inclined to gamble their survival on the assumption that someone else would do the necessary thing. Della built the fire. She was good at it. Mara had made sure they both were, back when it had seemed like a practical skill for the house, and turned out to be a practical skill for considerably more than that. The wood caught clean, and the room began to warm, slowly, the way stone structures do. They take a long time to heat and then hold warmth long after the fire has died down. Thorn tended the horses in the lean-to attached to the back of the structure. When he came back in, stamping snow from his boots, he looked at the fire and then at the 2 women and then sat down on the edge of one of the bunks with the economy of motion of a man who had been on the trail for a long time and knew how to conserve himself. "The broker in Millhaven," Mara said, because the fire was going and there was nothing else pressing and she had been thinking about it for most of the afternoon. "What's his name and what's the current arrangement?" Thorn looked at her. He was still unwinding from the ride. There was a process, she was observing, between him being on the trail and him being fully present in a room, a kind of gradual resettling. But he answered, "Name's Garrick Foss. Arrangement is he takes the pelts in the spring, pays me per unit at a rate he sets based on what he says the market is doing. I get the money in May. He keeps his percentage, which he says is 12. Which you suspect is more. 3 years running, his stated market rate has tracked low compared to what I've seen in passing. Prices mentioned in conversation, notices posted at the trading post, that kind of thing. I've got no documentation because I've never had anyone to keep it. I'll need to establish what the actual market rate should be. I can do that through the trading post in Mill Haven. They post price sheets. If Foss is telling you the market is at one level and the posted price is higher, that's the number I need to quantify. And then? And then we renegotiate, or we find a different broker. She held his gaze. There are always other brokers, if someone's willing to do the work of finding them and building the relationship. That's time investment up front and return on the back end. Thorne was quiet for a moment. You talk about it like it's certain. The math is certain. The execution is work. She paused. What's not certain is whether Foss has relationships with the other brokers in the region that would make switching costly. That's the risk. I'd need to know more before I could tell you which path makes more sense. Della, who had been sitting on the far bunk listening to this exchange, said, "She's been like this since she was 12, just so you know what you've gotten yourself into." Thorne looked at Della. Like what? Like she sees a problem and she just starts working it out loud. Like the problem is a machine and she's taking it apart to see how it runs. That's useful, he said. I know. I just wanted to warn you that dinner conversations are sometimes about crop yield and sometimes about ledger fraud, and you don't always get a vote in which one. A pause. Something moved through Thorne's expression that was closer to an actual smile than anything Mara had seen from him yet. Noted, he said. The storm came in after midnight. Mara knew because she woke to the sound of it hitting the roof. Not rain, not quite snow, but something in between, an icy mix that ticked against the stone like 1,000 small fingers. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room was cold in the way it gets when the warmth has been sitting still long enough that the cold finds the edges. She got up and rebuilt the fire. She did it quietly, not wanting to wake Della, and crouched in front of the hearth while the new wood caught and watched the flame establish itself. You don't sleep through weather, Thorne said from behind her. She turned. He was awake on his bunk, had been, apparently, before she'd gotten up. He was lying with one arm behind his head looking at the ceiling. I grew up in a house with a bad roof, she said. You learn to monitor. Makes sense. She settled back on her heels, watching the fire. The cut above your eye. Does it need tending? It's fine. That's not an answer. It's not infected. I've had worse. He paused. I don't need looking after. I'm not offering to look after you. I'm asking a practical question about whether one of my business partners is going to develop a head wound infection 2 days into our arrangement. A beat. It's clean. I checked it. Good. She looked back at the fire. Outside, the sleet or whatever it was continued its percussion against the roof. Tell me about the territory, the upper ridge lines. What's actually up there? In what sense? In the sense of, what are the limits, the natural boundaries, the areas where the operation could expand versus the areas where it can't? He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might tell her to go back to sleep, that this could wait for daylight. Instead, he started talking. He talked about the territory the way she talked about accounts, in specifics, with the ease of someone who had been holding the information a long time and was relieved to finally have somewhere to put it. The northern ridge that ran for about 12 miles and was prime territory in winter, but nearly inaccessible in the spring thaw. The eastern slopes, where the beaver population had recovered significantly over the last 3 years since a competing trapper had moved his operation south. The western ravines that he had barely touched, because working them alone was a logistics problem he hadn't solved. The western ravines are where the growth is, he said. I've known that for 2 years. I just couldn't get to it. What would you need to work it? Someone managing the eastern line so I can push west without losing ground on territory I've already established. He paused. And someone who can run the trade side so I'm not spending 2 weeks in May in Mill Haven that I could be using on the lines. Mara considered this. I can't run the eastern lines in deep winter. Not yet. I don't know the territory and I don't have the skills. No. So the expansion has to be staged. First season I'm learning, you're teaching, and we're consolidating what you already have. Second season, once I know the Eastern Territory well enough, you move west and I hold the East. She thought, 3 seasons before we're at full capacity, realistically. 2, if you learn fast. I'll learn fast, she said. Not as a boast, just as a statement of intent. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire had built up properly now, and the room was warming again. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "When I came into that barn," she turned to look at him. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I expected someone who needed rescuing. That was what I was told, that the Ashcroft woman was in a hard situation and needed a way out of it." Mara went very still. "Who told you that?" "Man I talked to at the trading post in Mill Haven about 3 weeks ago. I was asking around about account keepers in the valley towns, and he mentioned there was a woman in Frostville Crossing with a head for numbers and a bad situation, suggested she might be amenable to a change." "Who was the man?" "Gave his name as Colum. Didn't catch a family name." He paused. "You know him?" Mara thought about every man named Colum who had ever moved through Frostvale Crossing and came up with one. Colum Hewitt, who ran the feed store and was a quiet, careful man who had once told her 2 years ago that she was wasted on Beckett's accounts and ought to find a way out of the situation. She had thanked him and thought nothing more of it. "Maybe," she said. "It doesn't matter." But she held the information, turned it over. Someone had decided to help her, quietly and without announcement, by putting her name in front of the right person. She wasn't sure how she felt about that, whether it was interference or kindness or something in between. She decided to feel about it later. "When he said hard situation," she said carefully, "what exactly did he tell you?" "Father left debts, family name ruined, 2 daughters in a house they didn't own, working for the man who held the deed." A pause. "He didn't make it sound like charity was the answer. He made it sound like you specifically needed a situation where your actual abilities were the thing that mattered instead of your name." Mara looked at the fire. "And you decided on the basis of that to come to a matchmaking gathering and propose a business partnership." "I decided on the basis of that to come to town and ask around. The matchmaking gathering was convenience. I heard about it when I got to town and thought it was as good a place as any to have the conversation." He paused. "I wasn't planning on the barn doors." "The barn doors were dramatic. The horse spooked at the edge of town and came in faster than I wanted. I didn't exactly plan to make an entrance." Mara was quiet. Then something moved through her, not quite a laugh, but the muscle memory of one, the thing that happens just before a laugh. "You scared 30 people half to death. I noticed." Reuben Marsh broke a string on his fiddle. "He did?" The screech at the end. A pause. This time the almost smile was audible even without seeing his face. "I'll make it right with him. He won't care. He replaces strings constantly." She turned back to face the fire. "Get some sleep. The weather will clear by morning and we'll need an early start." "You checked the weather again?" "I listened to the storm. It's moving fast. By dawn it'll be east of us." She glanced back at him. "Sleep." "You're giving me orders," he said, and there was something in his voice that was the closest thing to warm she'd heard from him yet. "I'm making a practical suggestion to my business partner," she said. "There's a difference." He didn't say anything else. After a while his breathing shifted, not into sleep exactly, but into the quiet that precedes sleep in a person who knows how to rest when they need to. Mara sat by the fire until she was sure it would hold, and then she went back to her bunk. She lay in the dark and thought about western ravines and expanded territory, and a broker in Mill Haven who was probably taking more than his cut. She thought about the signed agreement folded in her coat pocket. She thought about Colum Hewitt at the feed store, and the quiet, unremarkable thing he had done that had somehow cascaded into her lying in a stone shelter 2 days' ride into the mountains, listening to sleet tick against the roof. She did not think about Frostvale Crossing at all. The storm had moved east by the time the sky began to pale, just as she'd said it would. They broke camp before full light, Della making short work of the fire, and Thorne packing the horses with the efficient speed of a man who had done it in the cold several hundred times. Mara replenished the wood stack. She had figured out the custom the night before, and had already calculated roughly how much needed to go back in, and was the last one out. The day's ride was harder than the first. The storm had left new snow on top of the old, and in places the trail was buried deep enough that Thorne had to break it ahead, his horse pushing through, and the rest of them followed in the channel he made. Mara's legs ached from the previous day's riding. She was competent on horseback, but not practiced at long mountain travel, and the muscles in her thighs and lower back were registering specific complaints about the new assignment they'd been given. She rode through it. The complaining muscles were not going to improve by being listened to. Through the morning, they gained elevation in a long series of switchbacks that made the trail feel endless, even as the landscape kept changing. Open meadows where the snow lay pristine and unmarked, dark corridors of spruce where the air felt 10 degrees colder than in the open, and then a long ridge walk with the valley spread out below them, impossibly far down, Frostville Crossing invisible in the distance. Della had gone quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. She wasn't sulking, she wasn't a sulking kind of person, but she was processing something, and Mara recognized the processing silence versus the ordinary silence and let it be. Around midday, Della pulled her horse up alongside Mara's and said, without preamble, "Are we actually going to be okay?" "I think so." "That's not a yes." "No, it's not." Mara looked at her sister. "Nothing's guaranteed. You know that better than anyone." "I know." Della was quiet for a moment. "But you think so?" "I think the math works if we work it. I think the operation is sound, if someone manages it properly. I think—" She stopped, chose words. "I think we walked away from a situation that had a ceiling. Whatever this is, it doesn't have the same ceiling." Della was quiet, absorbing. "Do you trust him?" Mara considered the question honestly. "I trust the contract. I trust that he reads contracts carefully and understands what they mean, which means he knew what he was agreeing to." She thought about the night before, the way he'd talked about the territory, the detail and precision of it. "And I trust that he's competent. That's not small." "What about the rest of it?" "The rest of it takes time," Mara said. "You can't know a person in 2 days." "Some people would say you can't agree to live with a person in 2 days either." "Some people have more options than we did." Della absorbed this. Then, "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone—" She considered. "Someone who was doing you a favor. Who knew he was doing you a favor." She looked toward the front of the column, where Thorne was breaking trail ahead. "He doesn't act like he's done you a favor." "He doesn't think he has," Mara said. "He thinks he made a business arrangement that benefits him." "Does he?" "Yes," Mara said. "And so did I." Della was quiet for a moment. Then she said, almost to herself, "I think I might actually like it here." Mara looked at the mountains around them, the white ridges and the dark trees, and the enormous open sky that seemed bigger up here than it ever did in the valley, less filtered, less divided by rooftops and fences, and the accumulated clutter of a town. She didn't say anything, but the thought moved through her like something she was only beginning to allow herself to feel. Not hope exactly, which felt too soft, too breakable. Something more structural. The sensation of standing on ground that might, this time, actually hold. The cabin appeared in the late afternoon, when the light was going golden and low, and the shadows were running long across the snow. It was not the cabin Mara had imagined, which she acknowledged to herself had been slightly too generous. What she had imagined, based on his description of it as sound enough, was something weathered but functional, chinked between the logs, roof intact. What was actually there was larger than expected and older than expected, and had clearly been through at least one significant winter event that had taken a section of the secondary roof over what appeared to be a storage addition on the east side. The main structure was solid. She could see that. The logs were good and the chinking looked adequate, and the stone chimney was intact. But the addition was a problem, and from here she could see daylight through the roof in at least 2 places. She looked at it for a moment. "The storage addition," she said. "I know," he said. "When did that happen?" "Ice storm, 3 weeks ago. Before I came down to town." He said it flatly, not apologetically, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated an apology. "I didn't have the time to repair it before I left, and it hadn't failed completely yet. But now it has." "Mostly." Mara looked at the tools she'd brought in her pack. She thought about the skills she'd accumulated over 8 years of maintaining a house that nobody was going to maintain for her. "It can be fixed," she said. "Not today, but it can be fixed." "I know." Do you have the materials? Boards, sealant, additional chinking? Boards, yes. Sealant, some. Chinking material I can make. He looked at her. You know how to roof? I know how not to fall off, she said. The technical aspects I can learn. Adela, who had pulled up beside them and was taking in the cabin with an expression of concentrated evaluation, said, The chimney's good, that's the main thing. She squinted at the main structure, and the porch looked salvageable. There's no porch, Thorne said. Della pointed. That beam running along the front could support one. He looked at the beam. It's a structural support. It's a structural support that already looks like it wants to be a porch, Della said. I'm just observing potential. Thorne looked at Della for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating. Then he dismounted and led his horse toward the small stable at the side of the cabin, and Mara took that as the signal to do the same. The inside was cold. It had been empty for several weeks, and dark, and smelled of pine and wood smoke and dried herbs that were bundled from the ceiling beams in the main room, which she had not expected. She touched one of the bundles as she moved through the space. Rosemary, or something close to it. Something medicinal. The main room had a stone hearth large enough to heat the space properly, a plank table, 2 chairs, shelving along one wall with supplies, and canned goods, dried meat, some grain, not enough for 3 people over the winter, but a start. A door on the north wall led to what appeared to be the sleeping room, which had a bunk built along one wall and a pallet on the floor and a window that let in the last of the evening light. It was not luxurious. It was very far from luxurious. The floor was hard-packed earth in the main room and rough board in the sleeping room, and there were places where the chinking between the main logs had dried out and let thin drafts in, and the sleeping room had clearly been built for 1 person and was now going to be asked to accommodate 3. Mara stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it. Della came in behind her and looked too. It's real, Della said softly. Yes, Mara said. It was not a comfortable observation exactly, but it was an honest one. The previous 2 days had had the quality of motion, movement away from something, momentum, the particular unreality of being in transition. Standing still inside 4 walls made it concrete in a way the trail hadn't. This was the place. This was the thing she had agreed to. Thorne came in from the stable. He looked at the 2 of them standing in the middle of the room. I'll start a fire, he said. It'll take a few hours to get warm. I'll help, Della said, and moved toward the wood box near the hearth. Mara walked to the shelving and started making an inventory. She did it the way she did everything, systematically, going shelf by shelf, noting quantities and conditions in the small notebook she had packed specifically for this purpose. Behind her, the fire caught and began to talk to itself, the low crackling sound of new wood finding its way to flame. What are you doing? Thorne asked from behind her. Inventory, she said without turning. We need to know what we have before we can plan for what we need. A pause. Then, in the tone she was beginning to recognize as his version of a compliment, start with the grain. That's the most critical. She did, and in the firelight, in the cold cabin that smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, with the snow banked against the walls outside, and the mountains pressing close, and everything she had owned for 26 years reduced to what she could carry on horseback, Mara Ashcroft opened her notebook to the first blank page and started writing things down. It was what she knew how to do. She was beginning to understand what this whole impossible venture was going to require. Not courage in any dramatic sense, but the willingness to do the ordinary necessary thing over and over until it accumulated into something that held. She wrote. The fire built. Outside, the mountain settled into its winter dark. The first month was the hardest thing Mara had ever done, and she had done some genuinely hard things. It wasn't any single element. It was the accumulation, the cold that never fully left the cabin, even with the fire going, the way the darkness came early and stayed late, the physical work that used muscles she had not previously known she possessed, and that informed her of their existence primarily through pain. It was learning to move in snowshoes without falling, which took her 4 days and a bruised hip and a cut on her palm from catching herself on a tree branch. It was the smell of raw pelts, which was a smell she had not anticipated, and which Della described with some accuracy as what she imagined the inside of a bear's thoughts would smell like. It was learning to read a man she shared close quarters with who communicated mostly in action and silence and occasional precise sentences that said exactly what was needed and nothing more. Thorne was a good teacher in the specific sense that he did not condescend and did not repeat himself unnecessarily and assumed competence until proven otherwise. He was a difficult teacher in the sense that he operated on the assumption that the fastest way to learn something was to do it, and his tolerance for doing things incorrectly while learning was considerably lower than his tolerance for simply not knowing yet. The distinction mattered. He was patient with ignorance. He had no patience for sloppiness. Mara was not sloppy. She established that early, and it changed the dynamic between them into something functional, and eventually into something she might have called, not friendship exactly, but a working trust. The kind that builds when two people are in a situation where trust is not optional, where the alternative to depending on each other is failing at something that matters. By the end of the third week, she could follow the eastern trap lines without getting turned around, which was its own particular accomplishment given that the territory looked, to an untrained eye, like an undifferentiated expanse of white and trees. Thorne had taught her to navigate by landmarks she would not have initially recognized as such. The specific shape of a ridge, the way a certain creek bent, a stand of birch that marked the boundary between two sections of line. "You navigate the way you read accounts," he told her one afternoon when they were checking the northeast section together. "You look for the pattern in it." "Isn't that how everyone navigates?" "No, most people try to memorize specific steps. Turn here, go that far, look for that thing. If one step is off, they're lost." He moved through the snow with an ease she was still working toward. "You read the whole picture. That's better." "How long before I can do this section alone?" He considered it. "Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. Depends on weather." 2 weeks, she said. He didn't argue. He had stopped arguing with her timelines after the first week, when she had consistently met everyone she set. But the accounting work she did in the evenings, at the plank table by the fire, with her notebooks spread out, and the inventory she'd built during that first night in the cabin, expanded now into a full operational picture. She had written to the trading post in Millhaven in the second week, sending the letter down with a trapper named Sorrel, who passed through heading south, asking for their current posted price sheets for beaver, mink, fox, and marten pelts by grade. She expected the response would take 2 or 3 weeks, and so she spent the interim building a model of what the operation's revenue should look like based on the numbers she was gathering from Thorne about yield and volume. What the model showed was worse than she'd expected, which told her the gap between what Foss was paying and what the market actually supported was not 12%, but something considerably larger. She went back over her calculations twice to make sure she wasn't making an error. She wasn't. She showed it to Thorne on the 20th evening, after Della had gone to sleep. He sat across from her at the table and looked at the numbers for a long time. "How confident are you in this?" he said. "Confident in the model. I need the price sheets to confirm the market figures I've estimated." She tapped the relevant column. "But the estimates are conservative. I used the lowest plausible market rate. If the real rate is higher, and I suspect it is, this gap is larger. Larger than a 20% skimming. Substantially larger." She looked at him steadily. "He's been doing this for 3 years, you said." Thorne's jaw had done something. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger in him didn't look like it would look on most people. It was more like a door closing in a controlled way. "Yes," he said. "Then the accumulated loss over 3 years at this differential is—" She turned the notebook so he could see the figure at the bottom of her calculations. He looked at it for a long time. "That's not recoverable," he said. "No," she said. "What's done is done. The question is what we do from here." She waited a moment. "I want to be clear that this is your decision. The operation was yours before I arrived. You know this territory and these relationships better than I do. But you have a recommendation." "I have an analysis. The recommendation follows from it." She set her pen down. "We don't confront Foss directly, not yet. We need the documented price differential first, or he'll simply tell you your estimates are wrong. Once we have the price sheets and can build an airtight comparison, we have 2 options: renegotiate from a position of documented evidence, or switch brokers and use the evidence as leverage with a new buyer to establish better initial terms." Thorn was quiet for a while. The fire made its sounds, and outside the wind was doing something against the north wall. "You said we," he said. "I said we. This is your fight as much as mine." "It's our operation," she said. "Yes." He looked at her across the table in the firelight, and something in his expression shifted in a way she didn't entirely know how to categorize. It wasn't soft exactly. He wasn't a soft man, but it was something that had opened slightly where it had been closed before. "All right," he said. "We wait for the price sheets." Della had been busy in ways that Mara had not entirely anticipated. She had, within the first week, reorganized the supply shelving in a way that made everything significantly more accessible and had explained her system to both Mara and Thorn with the efficiency of someone who had worked out a logical argument and expected it to be received on its merits. Thorn had looked at the new arrangement, looked at Della, and said fine, in a tone that meant he was actually impressed. She had also begun, quietly, and without making a project of it, doing things to the cabin that could be done without materials they didn't have. Chinking where the chinking had dried loose, rehanging the sleeping room door, which had never seated properly in its frame, and let cold in around the edges. Inventing small organizing solutions from wood scraps and salvaged wire that made the kitchen corner function better. And she had started on the porch. "You don't have to do this," Thorn said, the morning he came out to find her measuring the front beam with a length of string. "I know," Della said. "It'll add a sheltered workspace outside. Right now, when you're prepping pelts in winter, you're doing it inside or in the wind. A covered porch fixes that." Thorn considered this. "Where's the lumber coming from?" "The fallen pine on the eastern slope, the one that came down in the ice storm. The trunk is sound. I checked. It needs to be split and worked, but the material is there." She looked at him. "Can you split it? Or do you need help?" A long pause. "I can split it. Then I'll do the framing and fitting, and you do the heavy work, and we'll have it done in 2 weeks." Mara, watching this exchange from inside through the window, felt something that was almost amusement, and also something that was more serious. A recognition that her sister was good at this, at finding the thing that needed doing and doing it, and that this had always been true, but had never previously had room to operate. The porch project became the organizing project of the second and third weeks. Thorn split the lumber from the fallen pine in the early mornings before the trap rounds, and Della worked on it through the days, and Mara looked at the framing in the evenings and told Della where the load distribution was off, which happened twice, and Della fixed it both times without complaint. It wasn't finished in 2 weeks. It was framed and partially floored at the 2-week mark, which was better than nothing and better than Thorn had expected, and he said so, which for him constituted genuine praise. Della accepted this with a nod and went back to work. The three of them had settled into a routine that Mara would not have predicted. Not frictionless, because nothing with 3 people living in close quarters in a mountain winter was frictionless, but functional. They had discovered each other's rough edges and built small accommodations for them. Thorn's rough edge was that he needed silence in the mornings, specifically the first hour after waking, during which he was civil but not conversational, and interpreting anything he said during that window as representing his actual views or intentions was a mistake. Mara established this rule within the first 10 days and communicated it to Della without Thorn knowing she had done it. Della's rough edge was that she catastrophized when she was tired. Her assessment of situations deteriorated sharply after a hard day, and things that seemed manageable at noon seemed insurmountable at 8 in the evening. Mara knew this about her and had always known it, and Thorn, who observed most things, picked it up within the first 2 weeks and adjusted his timing for difficult conversations accordingly without being asked. Mara's rough edge, which she was somewhat less aware of than the others were, was that she solved problems at the expense of acknowledging they were problems. She did not complain, she did not express difficulty. She identified issues and addressed them and moved on, which was efficient, and also meant that the people around her sometimes didn't know that something was genuinely hard for her until she was already through it. Thorn said something about this at the end of the 3rd week, plainly and without accusation, in the way he said most things. "You pulled that snare cable with your bare hand," he said. They were coming in from the northeast lines, and her right hand was red from cold and slightly cut from where the cable had slipped. "It needed to be cleared, and I didn't have the tool positioned right." "You have gloves." The gloves would have been too thick to get the right grip on the cable. So you hurt your hand. It's minor. Mara. He stopped on the trail and looked at her with a directness that she had learned to recognize as him actually making a point rather than just talking. You're allowed to say something's hard. That's not weakness. It's information. She looked at him. The cold was significant, and the light was going, and they were a mile from the cabin, and her hand was stinging. It's hard, she said. Is it minor? Yes, but it hurts. He nodded. He dug in his pack and produced a strip of clean cloth. He carried it for the snares, but it served, and he wrapped her hand quickly and with a competence that said this was not the first time he had field-dressed a minor injury. Thank you, she said. It's practical, he said. I need your hands working. She understood as they walked back that this was his version of caring whether she was hurt. The practicality was real. He did need her hands working. But it was also the frame he put around other things, the container he used for what he wasn't yet prepared to say differently. She thought about saying this and decided it wasn't the moment. There would be a moment, or there wouldn't, and pressing it early would only make the container harder to open later. But the price sheets arrived at the end of the 4th week, delivered by Sorrel on his return north from Millhaven. He came through on a Tuesday in a light snowfall and stayed long enough for coffee, Della's coffee, which had earned its own small reputation among the scattered trappers and travelers who passed by the cabin, and to hand over the folded sheets with the trading post stamp on them. Mara read them at the table before Sorrel had finished his cup. The numbers were exactly as bad as her model had predicted, worse in the higher grades. The market rate for prime beaver, which was what comprised the bulk of Thorne's yield from the eastern lines, was running at a level that made the figure Foss had been paying look not like a broker's commission, but like systematic theft. She folded the sheets and put them with her notebooks and did not say anything at the table because Sorrel was there, and this was not his business. When Sorrel left, she spread everything out and showed Thorne the full comparison, her model alongside the actual posted rates, without preamble. Thorne looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and went outside. Mara let him. She understood that there are things a person needs to process in space rather than at a table, and that the mountains were better for that kind of processing than anything inside a cabin wall. He was gone for about 20 minutes. When he came back in, he sat down and said, "How do we do this?" "I need to know what you want out of it," she said. "Do you want what's owed from the past 3 years? Or do you want the best possible arrangement going forward, or both? Because the strategies are different. What's owed is gone. I told you that the night you showed me the first numbers. Well, you told me it wasn't recoverable. That's not the same as being gone." She kept her voice even. Foss ran a fraudulent arrangement. There may be legal recourse. I'd need to know what was written down at the time. Any original agreement, any receipts. He looked at her. There's an agreement, signed at the start. It doesn't specify the rate, just says fair market price. That phrase is doing a lot of work that it shouldn't be doing in your favor, she thought. But fair market price means something. It means the documented market price. If we can show the documented market price was consistently higher than what he paid you, that's breach. Can we prove it? I can try. The trading post keeps records going back. Sorrel said as much. He mentioned the post keeps a log of posted prices by month. If I can get 3 years of those, I can build the comparison. She looked at him. It's a lot of work, and there's no guarantee a dispute like this goes anywhere. It depends who you'd bring it to in Millhaven and whether they have any interest in straightening it out. There's a circuit magistrate who comes through in spring. That's our window then. She paused. But the priority right now is the new arrangement. We can't afford to spend the spring in a legal proceeding without income. We need a new broker in place before the melt, so the spring yield doesn't go through Foss by default. He thought about this. Sorrel, he said. What about him? He uses a broker in Millhaven, not Foss. I've never asked who because I wasn't in a position to do anything about it. He paused. He's still within a day of the cabin. Mara looked up from her notebooks. Can you catch him? If I leave now. She looked at the window. Late afternoon, light going. The snow that had brought Sorrel through was still coming down lightly. Go, she said. He was on his horse in 10 minutes. Della, who had come in from the porch project and absorbed the situation with the quick reading she was good at, watched him ride out through the window. "Is he going to catch him?" she asked. "Probably," Mara said. "He's fast in snow." "Is the broker thing going to work?" "I don't know yet." She turned back to her notebooks. "It depends on who Sorrel uses and what kind of arrangement they're willing to offer a new client." She paused. "And on what I can put together to make us look like a more attractive business than we currently are on paper." Della sat down across from her. "What does that mean?" "It means I need to write up an operational summary, volume, territory, projected expansion. Make the case that we're a growth operation, not a stable one. Brokers prefer growth clients. It means their commission grows with you." She opened to a clean page. "I'm going to need about 2 hours." Della did not question this. She got up, built the fire higher, and then went back to the porch because daylight was still technically available and she had boards to fit. Mara wrote. She had been writing things for other people her whole adult life: Beckett's accounts, her mother's household records, the careful documentation of things that belonged to other people. Writing something that belonged to her was different, not easier, harder in some ways because the stakes felt more personal, but different. She wrote the operation down as clearly as she could see it, what it was now, what it could be in 1 season, what it could be in 3. She wrote the territory assessment, the projected yield expansion, the reduction in brokerage costs that better terms would produce, and how that improvement compounded over years. She wrote it for a business audience, the way she had once written summaries for Beckett's creditors: lean, factual, no ornamentation. At the bottom, she wrote the names on the partnership agreement, which were her name and Thorne's, and she let that sit. 2 years ago, she had been keeping another man's books and sleeping in another man's house and attending gatherings where her presence was tolerated as a kind of annual reminder of what could go wrong for a family. She had not been working toward something of her own because there had been nothing to work toward. Looking at the operational summary, the specific and documented outline of an actual thing she was actually building, she felt something that was so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. It was ownership, not the legal kind, though that too. The other kind, the sense that the thing you were working on was yours, that its success would be yours, that its failure would land on you specifically rather than on some abstracted notion of circumstance. She had never had that before. She understood, sitting there, that this was what she had come here for, more than anything else. Not rescue, not partnership in any simple sense. This. She folded the operational summary into her notebook and waited. Out. Thorne came back 2 hours after dark, which was later than she'd expected. He was cold through and moved to the fire without speaking, which meant he was in the first hour after exertion state that she now knew to respect. She made coffee, or the approximation of it she'd worked out from their limited supplies, and put it on the table and went back to her own work. After a while he said, "Sorrel's broker is a woman named Hendricks, based in Millhaven, been operating for 12 years. Sorrel says she's straight." Meaning she pays what she says she'll pay. Meaning she pays what she says she'll pay, and she doesn't adjust the rate after the deal is struck, which is apparently also a thing that happens. Mara filed this under things she should have already anticipated and hadn't. What did Sorrel say about her terms? He didn't know the specific numbers, just that he was satisfied. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He gave me her location in town, said she'd see a new client if the operation was credible." Mara slid the operational summary across the table. He picked it up and read it, all the way through, in the silence he used for things he was actually considering. Then he read it again, which meant he was checking his own reading against the first pass. "This makes us look larger than we are," he said. "It makes us look like what we're going to be," she said. "If we're conservative, it undercuts the negotiating position. The projections are honest. I used conservative yield estimates. I didn't inflate anything. The expansion into the western ravines is achievable. You said so yourself." She met his eyes. "I didn't write anything we can't deliver." He looked at the summary once more, set it down. "When do we go to Millhaven?" "Early spring, before the thaw makes the roads difficult, but after we have the winter yield in hand to show actual production numbers." She thought. "And I want the 3-year price comparison done before we go. I want to walk into that meeting with the full picture. New broker opportunity and documented evidence of what Foss did. If Hendricks is as straight as Sorrell says, she'll understand the value of a client who left Foss because of fraud, not just because of rates. Thorne was quiet for a moment. That's a good move. It's the logical move. Those aren't always the same thing. She looked at him across the table. His face in the firelight was still cold-reddened from the ride, and tired, and there was something else in it. Not exactly warm, but the quality she'd been watching develop over 4 weeks of close quarters and hard work, the quality of a man deciding incrementally that a person could be trusted. No, she said. They're not. But in this case, they happen to align. Outside, the snow had stopped and the night was very clear, the kind of clear that only comes in deep winter at elevation, when the air is too cold to hold moisture and the stars look close enough that the distance is almost offensive. Mara knew this now. She had learned the night sky up here, the way it looked different from the valley sky, harder and more present. She was learning a lot of things. That was, she supposed, what the first season was for. Della came in from wherever she'd been and stopped in the doorway, reading the room with the efficiency she had for these things. She looked at the papers on the table and at Thorne's face and at Mara. Good news or complicated news? She asked. Both, Mara said. Della hung up her coat. Tell me about the complicated part first. I can handle the good part after. So Mara told her. The broker contact, the plan, the timeline. And as she talked through it, the shape of the next few months laid out plainly in the firelit room, she felt the thing that had been building for 4 weeks take on a little more weight, a little more solidity. Not certainty. She wasn't naive enough for certainty, but something close enough to it that she could sleep on it, which for now was what she needed. Winter broke slowly, the way it does in the high mountains. Not a clean ending, but a long argument between cold and warmth that the cold kept winning for weeks past the point where it seemed fair. March came in with a blizzard that buried the porch Della had finished in February under 3 feet of new snow, and Della stood at the window looking at it with an expression that was mostly philosophical and only slightly murderous. April was better. The snowpack began to consolidate rather than grow, and the days stretched enough that there was actual light in the late afternoon rather than just a pale suggestion of it. And the horses, which had been sensibly miserable all winter, began to show signs of having opinions again about things other than the stable. They had a good winter yield, better than Thorne's previous seasons, which he attributed to the consolidation of the eastern lines that Mara had taken over in January. She was running them independently by week 6, as she'd said she would. And the preliminary incursion he'd made into the western ravines in February, which had produced better numbers in 2 weeks than he'd gotten from some established lines in a full month. Mara had the numbers documented in 3 notebooks, organized by line and grade and date. She had the 3-year price comparison completed, built from the record she'd obtained from the trading post in Millhaven through a second letter sent with Sorrell in January. The records had come back in February, and what she'd built from them was thorough enough that she had gone over it 4 times looking for errors, because she wanted to be certain before she put it in front of anyone. She had found 2 minor errors, 1 transcription mistake and 1 calculation that she'd done correctly, but had then transferred to the summary sheet wrong. And she had corrected them and gone over it a 5th time and found nothing else. The documented shortfall over 3 years compared to what Foss should have been paying under any reasonable interpretation of fair market price was a figure that made Thorne go very quiet when she showed him the final version. Is this defensible? He said. If I took it to the magistrate. It's documented, she said. Whether it's defensible depends on the magistrate and on whether Foss has a counterargument, which he might. He could claim the market assessments in the records reflect a different grade of product, or that there were transportation costs he was absorbing. She paused. But we can rebut those arguments if they come up. I've run the numbers on transportation cost scenarios, and even with a generous estimate for his expenses, the shortfall doesn't close. Thorne looked at the summary page for a long time. You did this all winter, he said. It was the evenings, she said. I wasn't doing much else. That's not what I meant. He looked up from the page. It's detailed, Mara. This is a lot of work. She met his eyes. This was the longest look they had exchanged since November, and it had the quality of something that had been building through a winter of close quarters and shared difficulty and the accumulated weight of many small moments. Her hand wrapped in the trail, his voice at the stone shelter asking what happened to her, the evenings at the plank table where they talked through the operation, and the talking had gradually started, including other things, small things, the kind of things that slip into conversation when two people stop treating conversation as purely functional. "It's ours," she said. "The operation. It's mine to work on." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to for the content it carried. Then he looked back at the notebook. "All right," he said. "We go to Millhaven." They went in the second week of April, when the road was passable but not yet rutted into mud by the spring traffic. Della stayed at the cabin, a decision Mara had reached reluctantly, and Della had argued against vigorously until Mara laid out the specific reasons. The cabin couldn't be left empty with the spring yield stored in it. Someone needed to receive sorrel, and two other trappers who had said they'd pass through in early April, and Della was, by this point, the most competent person for the task. This last argument worked where the first two hadn't. "Don't let Sorrel stay more than one night," Della said at the door with her arms crossed. "He talks for hours if you let him." "I know," Mara said. "And if the east line by the creek shows anything, check the snare cable on the third set. I've been watching it and it's not seating right." "I'll mention it." Della looked at her. "Be careful in town." "It's a town, not a frontier. Towns have people in them. People are worse than frontiers." She glanced at Thorne, already mounted and waiting at a diplomatic distance. "Both of you be careful." They rode out, and Mara did not look back this time either, though for different reasons than she'd had in November. In November, she had not looked back because there was nothing to look at. Now she didn't look back because what was behind her was worth something, and looking back felt like the wrong direction. The road to Millhaven was 2 days south and east, dropping out of the mountain territory and through a broad valley before coming into the town itself, which was considerably larger than Frostvale Crossing, a proper trading center with a main street of several blocks and a permanent population and the particular energy of a place where things actually happened. Mara had been there twice in her life, both times briefly, both times in the company of someone else's business. She arrived this time in the company of her own. They came into town in the late afternoon of the second day and found a boarding house where they took 2 rooms, which Mara paid for from the operations fund she had been maintaining since December. A disciplined savings from small economies that had accumulated into something meaningful. Over dinner in the boarding house's common room, she laid out the next day's agenda. "Hendricks first," she said. "That meeting is the one where preparation matters most. We need the new brokerage arrangement in place before we approach Foss, because if Foss hears we're looking for alternatives, he could cause problems." "What kind of problems?" "He knows the broker network in this town better than we do. If he's connected, and a man who's been operating here for a decade is probably connected, he could put word out that we're difficult clients, make it harder to establish with someone new." She looked at her coffee. "So Hendricks first, terms agreed and written if possible. Then Foss." Thorne was cutting his bread with the focused attention he gave to things when he was actually listening. "And at Foss?" "At Foss, I do the talking." He looked up. "I know that's not how you'd prefer to do it," she said. "But this is documentation and calculation. If you go in there wanting to recover what he took from you, the conversation becomes about anger, and he'll use that. If I go in with the numbers, it's a different conversation." A pause. He was working through it, she could tell. Not his instinct, which was probably to go have a different kind of conversation with Foss entirely, but the logic of what she was saying was visible to him because he was not, underneath the size and the silence and the capacity for bluntness, an irrational man. "What's the goal?" he said. "At Foss. What do we want to walk out with?" "Acknowledgement, ideally. A settlement offer, if he's smart enough to make one. If he's not smart enough, we document the meeting, and we take the evidence to the circuit magistrate in the spring session." She held his gaze. "We won't get everything back. I want you to understand that going in, what we might get is a partial settlement that's better than nothing, and a clean exit, and a documented record that establishes his conduct for anyone else who might need it. Like other trappers he's done this to." "That's my suspicion, yes." Thorne was quiet for a long moment. He drank his coffee. He looked at the table. "Fine," he said. "You do the talking." Hendricks operated out of a building on Millhaven's secondary commercial street. Not the main thoroughfare, but the one behind it, which Mara took as a deliberate choice. Main Street rents were higher, and the clients who needed to display their own importance sought them out. Hendricks, apparently, had enough of a reputation that her clients found her. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been in negotiations long enough that they've stopped needing to move around to establish presence. She looked at Mara and Thorne when they came through her door, looked at the notebooks Mara was carrying, and said, "Sit down," in the tone of someone who had already decided to have the meeting. Her office was functional and slightly cluttered, with price sheets and correspondence layered across every surface in a system that appeared chaotic, and was almost certainly not. "Sorrel mentioned you might come," she said. "He said the operation was worth looking at." She looked at Mara specifically. "He said you'd be the one to talk to." "The operation is jointly held," Mara said. "Equal partnership, documented. But yes, I manage the trade side." Hendricks nodded. "Show me the production numbers." Mara opened her notebook and presented the winter yield figures, by line and grade, which she had organized specifically for this meeting. The actual numbers and the projected numbers for the following season with the Western expansion factored in. She had built the Western projection conservatively, more conservatively than she privately believed was accurate, because she had learned from watching Beckett's business that promising more than you could deliver was a faster way to lose credibility than almost anything else. Hendricks looked at the numbers. She asked specific questions about the eastern lines, about the yield consistency across the winter, about the breakdown between beaver and the secondary pelts. They were good questions, the kind that came from actually knowing the business rather than performing knowledge of it. Mara answered all of them directly. When she didn't have a number available immediately, she said so and found it in the notebook rather than approximating. "Who were you selling through?" Hendricks asked. "Foss," Thorne said. A brief pause. Something crossed Hendricks' face that lasted about a quarter second before she controlled it. "For how long?" 3 years, Mara said. "We're ending that arrangement. That's part of why we're here." "Just ending it, or is there more to that story?" Mara looked at her. "There's documentation," she said, "that suggests the arrangement was not honored in good faith on Foss's part. We're pursuing that separately. I wanted to be direct about it with you because I'd expect you to hear about it through other channels eventually, and I'd rather you heard it from me first." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "How thorough is the documentation?" "Thorough," Mara said. 3 years of posted market prices against 3 years of paid rates. The differential is significant. Are you planning to take it to the magistrate?" "We're considering our options." Hendricks looked at her with the expression of a person recalibrating. Then she looked at Thorne, then back at Mara. "My standard terms are 8%, she said, for a first-year client. If production figures hold through the first season, that drops to 6 in year 2. Mara had been anticipating 10 as an opening, which meant Hendricks was either genuinely interested or making a point. 6% from the start, Mara said. The production figures and the Western expansion justify it. You're not taking on an established small client. You're taking on a growth operation at the beginning of its expansion phase. Hendricks looked at the notebook again, at the Western Ravine projections, at the 3-year yield trend on the eastern lines. 7, with a review at 6 months, she said. If the spring yield meets these numbers, we move to 6 from that point forward. Mara looked at Thorne. It was a brief look, a question. He gave her the smallest nod. 7 with the review, Mara said. And I want payment timing written explicitly. Within 30 days of product delivery, no exceptions. That's my standard term anyway. Then it should be easy to write it down. Something moved across Hendricks' face that Mara could not quite read. Not quite amusement, but something that suggested she had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. We'll write it down, Hendricks said. Check. The agreement with Hendricks took 2 hours to negotiate in full, and came out in Mara's handwriting on paper provided by Hendricks, signed by all 3 of them, and witnessed by Hendricks' assistant, a young man named Pete, who seemed to be watching Mara with the specific attention of someone learning something. They left Hendrick's office in the early afternoon with a signed brokerage agreement and a meeting scheduled for the following week to hand over the winter yield for assessment and pricing. Mara stood on the street outside and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Not done easily. It hadn't been easy. She'd been running calculations and contingencies in her head throughout the entire meeting, but done right, which was better. 7%, Thorne said. Foss was taking 20 at minimum, probably more. She looked at him. Even at 7, this season's net is significantly better than any year you've had with him. He was quiet for a moment. I know. He looked down the street toward the main commercial district. Foss's office is on the main street, North End. I know. I looked it up this morning. She pulled her coat tighter. The spring air was mild by mountain standards, but still cold by any other measure. Are you ready for that one? I've been ready for that one since November, he said. That's what I'm worried about, she said. Ready in the sense of prepared, or ready in the sense of wanting to walk through his door and damage something? He turned to look at her. There was something in his expression, not offense, but the edge of it. I'm not going to damage anything, he said. I know what this is. I know you know. I'm asking how you feel about it, which is different. The edge in his expression shifted into something she recognized more now than she had in November. The thing that happened when she said something that landed directly in a place he'd been trying to manage on his own. I feel like a man who spent 3 years working in good faith with someone who was taking advantage of that, he said. That's how I feel. But I understand what you said last night about how this conversation needs to go. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They walked north. Garrick Foss was a man who had designed his office specifically to communicate the kind of success that makes other people feel their own position more acutely. Heavy furniture, expensive lamp oil burning in the middle of the afternoon, a desk positioned so that whoever sat across from it was slightly lower than he was. Mara clocked all of this in the time it took to cross from the door to the chairs he indicated with a gesture that was just barely on the acceptable side of dismissive. He knew who Thorne was. He did not know who she was, and he took approximately 4 seconds to decide she was not important, which was a mistake she was not going to correct for him. Thorne, he said pleasantly, I wasn't expecting you until May. We had business in town, Thorne said. He was doing the thing she'd asked him to do, which was say as little as possible, and he was doing it with an effort that Mara could sense without looking at him. And you are... Foss directed this at Mara with the blandly polite tone of a man asking about something he doesn't expect to interest him. Mara Ashcroft, she said. I manage the trade side of the Thorne Ashcroft operation. A slight pause. I wasn't aware there was a Thorne Ashcroft operation. It was formalized in November. She opened her notebook on her knee. I'm here about the brokerage arrangement. Specifically, we're ending it, effective immediately. The spring yield will go through a different broker. Foss looked at her, then at Thorne, then back at her. Is there a problem with the arrangement? He said, in the tone of a man who had prepared for this possibility and had a response ready. Several, she said. I've done a comparative analysis of the rates you paid Mr. Thorne over the past 3 years against the posted market prices at the Millhaven Trading Post for the same periods. The differential is significant and consistent, which indicates it was not the result of market fluctuation. Foss set down the pen he'd been holding. Posted prices at the Trading Post reflect a general market. There are variables in any individual transaction: transportation, assessment, risk. I've accounted for those, she said, including a transportation cost assumption that is, frankly, more generous to you than your actual costs likely warrant. She slid a page across his desk, the summary sheet, the one she'd checked 5 times. The net shortfall across 3 years, even with the generous expense assumptions, is here. He looked at the page. His expression did not change significantly, which told her he was experienced enough to control it. This is your analysis, he said, based on documented market data. Based on your interpretation of documented market data. He looked up at her. These things are always more complicated than a simple comparison suggests. There are reasons the rates were what they were. I'd be interested to hear them, she said, specifically and in writing. A beat. I'm not in the practice of because the circuit magistrate comes through in May, she said, And if you'd like to explain those reasons to him instead, that's also an option. The room went quiet. Thorne was very still beside her. Foss looked at the summary page on his desk, and Mara watched him run through his calculations. The same kind she ran, except his were about exposure and risk rather than yield and rates. "What do you want?" he said. "A settlement," she said. Something that reflects a good faith acknowledgement of the gap, that doesn't require a magistrate's time, and doesn't require us to circulate the documentation to other trappers in this region who may have had similar arrangements with you." The last phrase landed. She saw it land. "You're threatening me," he said. "I'm describing the alternative to settling," she said. "Those are different things." Another silence. Foss picked up the summary page and looked at it again. "I'll need time to review this properly. You have until tomorrow morning. We're in Millhaven until then." She stood up. "I'd suggest you look at it carefully. The documentation is complete." She walked to the door. Thorne came with her, and she was aware of the effort it was taking him to leave the room calmly, because she had come to know his body language over a winter of close quarters, and she could read it now, the tension in his shoulders, the controlled quality of his movement. They made it to the street. He stood there for a moment in the afternoon sun and breathed. "That went about as well as it could," she said. "He'll try to lowball the settlement." "Probably. That's fine. We have room to negotiate down from the full figure and still come out with something meaningful." She looked at him. "How are you doing?" He looked back at her. "Ask me that again when we have a number." "Fair enough." They had supper at a different boarding house restaurant than the night before. Because Mara had looked at the prices and calculated that variety was within budget, and she had decided at some point in the last 3 months that small decisions in favor of things that weren't strictly necessary but were generally better were an acceptable use of a healthy operations fund. Thorne had the kind of meal a man has when he has been eating trail food and cabin provisions for 4 months, thorough and without much conversation. And Mara found she was hungrier than she'd realized, which happened sometimes when she was running on a lot of mental energy and forgot that her body was also a system that needed fuel. After eating, they sat with coffee in the quieter end of the room, and Thorne said without particular preamble, "You were good in there." "It was preparation," she said. "Preparation isn't the same as good." She looked at him. "What's the difference?" You didn't get rattled when he pushed back on the interpretation. You had the answers ready, but it wasn't just that you had them ready. It was the way you delivered them." He looked at his coffee. "Like you expected him to push back and had already decided how you were going to feel about it." "I had," she said. He was always going to push back. Anticipating that and deciding in advance that it wasn't going to change my position meant I didn't have to make that decision in the moment. Thorne was quiet for a while. Then, "Is that something you learned or something you were born with?" "Learned," she said. 8 years of being in situations where the wrong reaction cost you something you couldn't afford to lose." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "You learn to think ahead, to decide who you're going to be in a room before you walk into the room." He looked at her with the look she was still getting used to, the direct evaluating look that had no performance in it, that was just him seeing what was there. "Who were you going to be in that room?" he said. "Someone who couldn't be moved," she said. "Were you moved?" She thought about it honestly. When he said it was my interpretation, for about half a second, she met his eyes. Then I remembered I'd checked the math 5 times. A pause. Then Thorne laughed, an actual laugh, short and genuine and slightly rough from disuse, the laugh of a man who doesn't laugh often enough to have it come out smoothly. It changed his face completely. She had thought she knew his face by now, had been looking at it across a table and across mountain trails for 4 months. But this was different. This was the face underneath the face he kept on. She looked away before she could decide too much about what to do with that. Foss sent a message to the boarding house at 7 the following morning. It named a figure. The figure was, as Thorne had predicted, a lowball, about 40% of the documented shortfall. Mara wrote back in Foss's own messenger's hand, having the young boy wait while she did it. She named a counter figure at 70% and said she would be at the boarding house until noon. At 10:30, a second message arrived. It met her at 60%. She thought about it for 11 minutes, which was the time it took her to run through the remaining options and their costs, and to decide that 60% recovered now was worth more in practical terms than a magistrate proceeding that would take until summer and cost them time they could better use on the western ravines. She sent back an acceptance, conditional on payment before they left town. Cash arrived at 11:45 with a signed release she had drafted herself and sent along with the acceptance message. She read the release, confirmed it said what she needed it to say, and signed it. Thorne signed it. The messenger took it back. They rode out of Millhaven just after noon. For the first mile, neither of them said anything. The road north ran alongside a creek that was running fast with snowmelt, full and loud and clear brown with the tannins of spring, and the sound of it filled the space that words would have occupied. 60%, Thorne said eventually. 60% of a significant figure, she said, which is now in the operations fund, which will invest in the western expansion. He was quiet for another moment. He'll do it to someone else. Yes, she said. I know, but I left Hendricks with a copy of the documentation, and I left a copy at the trading post, and I told Sorrel the full story when I ran into him this morning. She looked at the road ahead. It won't stay quiet. Whether it goes to the magistrate or not, people in this region will know. That's what I can do. The rest is someone else's problem. Thorne absorbed this. Riding beside her in the spring light, with the creek running loud and the mountains visible ahead, he looked different from how he'd looked in November. Not softer exactly, but less coiled, like something had been set down. The contract with Hendricks, he said, 7% from spring, 6% from fall if numbers hold. Numbers will hold. I know, she said. He looked at her. I wanted to say, what you built this winter. The documentation, the operational summary, the accounts. That's not... I didn't know what I was getting when I asked you to come. I thought I was getting someone who could manage the books. You were getting someone who could manage the books. I was getting more than that, he said. She looked at the road. The books were just where I started. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. I know that now. The mountain road curved north and began to climb, the way it always did at the edge of the valley, the way she now recognized as the transition between the world of towns and dealings and other people's offices and the specific world that was theirs. The ridge lines and the trap lines and the cabin with the porch Della had built and the fire that held heat in the stone long after the wood burned down. She was ready to be back. They came back to the cabin on the second evening, same as they'd left. Two riders on a mountain trail with the light going gold and the trees pressing close on both sides, and the smell of pine and cold water that Mara had, somewhere in the 5 months since November, stopped noticing as a foreign smell and started carrying as something familiar. Della heard the horses and came out onto the porch before they reached the stable. She was wearing her work coat and had sawdust on her sleeve, which meant she'd been doing something structural again. And she stood at the top of the porch steps with her arms crossed and looked at them with the expression she reserved for situations where she wanted information immediately but was going to make herself wait for it like a reasonable person. She lasted about 4 seconds. Well, she said. Hendricks at 7%, Mara said, dismounting, moving to 6 in the fall if the numbers hold. They'll hold, Della said. And Foss? 60% settlement. Signed and paid. Della was quiet for a moment, absorbing. Then she stepped off the porch and took the reins of Mara's horse without being asked, which was something she did when she felt strongly about something and wanted to do something physical with it. 60%, she said, of a significant number. How significant? Mara told her. Della stopped walking. She stood in the path between the cabin and the stable, holding 2 horses, and looked at the figure the way you look at something that takes a moment to become real. Mara, she said, it's in the operations fund. It's not spending money. I know that. Della started walking again. I know that. She glanced back over her shoulder. Are you all right? I'm tired and I want to sit down somewhere that isn't a saddle, Mara said. Otherwise, yes. Della took the horses. Thorne took his own to the stable. Mara went inside. The cabin was warm. Della had the fire going, had clearly been maintaining it at a level that anticipated their return. and it smelled of wood smoke and the dried herb bundles that still hung from the rafters, and something that turned out to be a pot of actual stew sitting on the iron rack over the coals. Mara stood in the middle of the main room for a moment and felt the specific relief of a space that had become, without her fully noting the moment it happened, home. She sat at the plank table and did not open a notebook. That, more than anything else, was the sign of how tired she was. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the fire and let her mind be quiet for the first time in 4 days. Oops. They told Della the full story over supper, the Hendricks meeting, the Foss confrontation, the 11 minutes of calculation before accepting 60%, the signed release, and the cash and the ride out of Millhaven in the noon light. Della listened to all of it with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered, asking a question here and there, the right questions. When they finished, she sat back and said, "He'll be more careful now." "Foss?" Thorne said. "Men like that are always more careful after they get caught for a while." She pushed her stew around her bowl. "It doesn't usually last long enough for the word to get around," Mara said. "I left documentation with Hendricks and the trading post. Sorrel knows. That information will move through the trapper community faster than we will." Della nodded. Then she looked at Thorne. "And the Western Ravines? When do you start?" "May," he said, "once the snowpack settles enough for the lines to be stable." "I'll be running the eastern section independently by then," Mara said. "We worked it through the winter. I know the lines well enough." Della looked between them. It was a particular look she had, the observational one, the one that had been watching her sister her entire life and had developed a precision that was sometimes uncomfortable. "You two work well together," she said. "We have compatible methods," Mara said. "That's not what I said." A pause. Thorne was looking at his bowl with the focused attention of a man who has decided to let a conversation happen around him. "Della," Mara said. "I'm just observing," her sister said. "That's allowed." "Oh." The spring moved in the way mountain springs do, gradually, then suddenly. One week the snowpack was solid, and the trails were still winter-hard, and the next week the creeks were loud and the south-facing slopes were showing bare ground, and the air had that particular edge of melt and green underneath the cold that meant something was changing in the deep layers. Thorne started the Western Ravine work in the first week of May. He was up before light on the first morning and gone by the time Mara came out of the sleeping room, and she ran the eastern section alone for the first time without him anywhere in reach, which was different from running it with him a few miles away. It was fine. She had known it would be fine, but knowing a thing and doing it are different weights, and she felt the difference in the first hour, and then it settled and she stopped feeling it, which was the right outcome. She got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, wrote up the day's section notes, started the fire, and had supper ready by the time Thorne came in from the Western Territory with the particular look of a man who had seen something he'd been waiting to see for a long time. "How is it?" she asked. He sat down and looked at his hands for a moment. "Better than I thought." "The yield potential?" "The yield potential, the territory, all of it." He looked up. I've been looking at those ravines from the eastern ridge for 2 years, knowing there was something there I couldn't get to." He paused. "It's better than looking at it from a distance." Mara thought about this, about things that look different from a distance versus up close, about the gap between what you can see and what you can reach, and what it takes to close it, and whether the closing ever looks like you thought it would. "Write it down," she said, "what you saw, the specific locations, the territory features, tonight, while it's fresh." "I know the territory." "You know it now. Write it down so we have it documented." She met his eyes. "This is how we build something that holds, not just in our heads." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and got his own notebook. She had given him one of the spare ones in February, and he used it differently than she used hers, in shorter bursts with longer gaps, but he used it, and he sat down and started writing. She sat across from him and did her own evening accounts. The fire talked to itself. Somewhere outside, a bird that hadn't been there in winter was trying out the evening air. This was what most of it looked like, Mara thought, not confrontations in offices or storms on mountain trails. This, 2 people at a table, doing the work, in a room that held warmth. She did not plan what happened later that evening. She was not a person who did things without planning them, which made the absence of a plan both unusual and, in retrospect, probably necessary. Thorne had finished his notes, and she had finished her accounts, and Della had long since gone to sleep. Della, who worked physically hard all day and fell asleep with the reliable promptness of someone whose body made the decision without consulting her mind. The fire was lower now, coals more than flame, the room in the particular half-dark that happens when firelight is the only light. She was putting her notebooks away when he said her name, not Mara, the way he said it when he needed her attention. The other way. The way that had started appearing in the last month, quiet and without announcement, that she had been carefully not addressing because addressing it had felt like a door she wasn't sure she was ready to open. She looked at him. He was sitting at the table still, not moving, with his hands flat on the surface, not unlike, she realized, the way she'd sat when she came in from Millhaven, just needing to be still for a moment. "The personal arrangement," he said. "The thing you said in Elias's kitchen, that it was separate." "Yes," she said. "I've been waiting for you to bring it up." "I've been waiting for the right time," she said, "and for the business to be stable enough that whatever we said to each other wasn't tangled up with everything else." "And now?" She looked at him. The cabin around them, the mountains outside, the porch Della had built, and the notebooks on the shelf and the signed agreement in her coat pocket that said half, that had always said half. "Now the business is stable," she said. He got up from the table. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the barn in November, like he'd found something he'd been looking for, except that it was different now because she was different, or maybe because they both knew more about what they were looking at. "I'm not good at this," he said. "The talking part." "I know," she said. "I am. So I'll say it." She looked up at him. "I didn't come here to be rescued. I came because the math made sense and the contract was fair, but somewhere in the winter I started looking forward to the evenings, to the table, to you." She held his gaze. "That wasn't in the contract." "No," he said. "It wasn't." "I'm not asking you to be something you're not," she said. "I'm not asking for smooth or easy. I'm asking—" "Mara," he said quietly, "I know what you're asking." He put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, the way he did things when he was being deliberate. The same way he read contracts, the same way he moved on difficult trail. And she let herself lean into it just slightly, which was harder than anything else she'd done in 5 months because she had spent so long not leaning on anything. She was not repaired. She understood that. 8 years of being told your name was a problem, and your situation was your fault, and your presence at the table was a courtesy that could be withdrawn. That doesn't come out in one winter, however good the winter is. It leaves marks the way cold leaves marks. You carry them differently over time, but you carry them. What she had learned here, in this specific place with these specific people, was that carrying them didn't mean being defined by them. The marks were hers. The rest of her was also hers. Both things were true, and the second one had stopped being conditional on the first. Cale Thorne was not a simple answer to a complicated situation. He was his own complicated situation. A man who had lived alone in mountains for years because the world of people required negotiations he hadn't known how to make. Who communicated in silence and action and occasional precise sentences because he had not been in a context where more than that was safe. He had his own marks. They just looked different. What they had built this winter was not a love story in any clean sense. It was something more like a mutual recognition. Two people who had both been operating below their actual capacity for different reasons, in the same place at the same time, discovering that the missing variable for each of them was something the other one had. That wasn't poetry. It was math. And Mara had always trusted math. Sorrel came through in the 3rd week of May, heading north with supplies, and stayed one night. He told them that word about Foss had moved through the trapper community with the speed that only genuine scandal achieves, and that 2 other trappers had already pulled their arrangements. He told them Hendricks had, quietly and without public announcement, begun refusing new clients from Foss's former network, which was its own kind of statement. "You started something," Sorrel said at the supper table to Mara. "I documented something," she said. "Other people started things with it." "That's a careful distinction." It's an accurate one. Sorrel looked at Thorn. She always like this? Yes, Thorn said. Is it exhausting? A pause. Something moved across Thorn's face. The almost smile she had learned to read, which meant that whatever he was about to say was as close to warmth as he generally got in front of other people. No, he said. Sorrel looked between them with the expression of a man who has correctly assessed a situation and is choosing not to comment on it. He drank his coffee. Della, next to him, was examining the porch beam through the window with the focused interest of someone thinking about the next phase of a project, which meant she was planning another addition that nobody had asked for and everyone would end up grateful for. Mara looked at the room, at Thorn across the table, at Della by the window, at the notebooks on the shelf and the fire and the herbs hanging from the rafters and the door that sat properly in its frame now. At the porch outside, built from a fallen pine, that turned out to be exactly what they needed and that none of them had known they needed until Della had measured it with a piece of string. This was the thing about building, she thought. You didn't always know in advance what the structure needed. Sometimes you needed to be in it for a while, through a hard season, before you understood the shape of what was missing. She had spent 8 years being told she was a problem, a name with debt attached, a woman in a room waiting to not be chosen. She had believed it more than she had known, in the way that things you hear repeatedly start to feel like gravity. Not something anyone announced, just the way the world inclines. She did not believe it anymore. Not because Kyle Thorne had walked into a barn and chosen her. That was the beginning of a sentence, not the whole of it. She did not believe it anymore because she had come to a mountain in November with what she could carry, and she had worked a winter of genuine hard things, and she had sat across from Garrick Foss with 5 checked and rechecked notebooks and not been moved, and the operation was real and the numbers were good, and half of it was hers. She had stopped being someone that things happened to. That was the whole of it. Some people come to that understanding young and easily, and some people need a longer road and a colder season and a barn door coming off its hinges at the right moment. Mara Ashcroft had needed the longer road. She did not hold that against herself anymore. The road was what it was, and she was where it had brought her, and where it had brought her was, on balance, worth the walk. The spring yield went to Hendricks in the last week of May. The numbers met the projections. The eastern lines were consistent with the winter figures, and the western ravines came in higher than Thorne's own estimates, which surprised him and did not surprise Mara, who had built her projections from his conservative estimate but had privately suspected the actual potential was higher. Hendricks sent the payment 30 days later, exact to the date, with a note that said simply, "Good season. Look forward to the fall." Mara filed the note with the accounts. 7% of a good season was, in real terms, the difference between an operation that was surviving and an operation that was building. She put the capital allocation into the notebook she kept for long-term planning, the second-year expansion, the additional trapline equipment, the repairs to the storage addition roof that still needed proper work before the following winter. The roof she and Thorne did themselves in June, on 3 successive clear days, working from the top of a ladder with boards and sealant while Della handed things up and offered opinions from below. It was not graceful work. Mara fell off the ladder once, caught herself on the roof edge, and had a bruised forearm for a week. Thorne swore comprehensively when the sealant got into a cut on his palm. The finished roof was solid and weatherproof and slightly uneven in one section that Della pointed out, and both of them chose to consider a character feature. It held through the first fall storms without a single leak. That was what Mara thought about when she thought about what they'd built that year. Not the Foss settlement, or the Hendricks contract, or even the Western ravines, though all of those mattered. She thought about the roof. Imperfect, functional, built by hand, holding against whatever came down from the mountains. That was the word for it. That was what she had been looking for without knowing it, through 8 winters of attending other people's gatherings and keeping other people's books and standing near the wall while the fiddle played. Not to be chosen, not to be saved, not even to be loved, though that too, in the end, in its own unpolished and unannounced way. To build something that held. She had. There is a particular kind of person who gets told, early and often, that their circumstances are their identity, that what happened to their family or their name or their money is the permanent and defining fact of who they are. The world is full of rooms where these people stand near the walls, waiting for a verdict that was delivered years ago to be revised. Most of the time, nobody revises it. The room goes on being the room. What changes is when a person stops waiting for revision and starts building something outside the room entirely. Not without difficulty. The difficulty is always real. The cold is always cold. The math doesn't always work out. But with the specific clarity that comes from deciding that the verdict was wrong and that the proof of its wrongness is not an argument but a result. Mara Ashcroft didn't need Frostville Crossing to change its mind about her. She needed a mountain and a contract and a winter long enough to find out what she was actually made of. It turned out to be more than enough.